In just the past hour, the King has delivered a personal message about his experience.
The moment King Charles received the report, everything changed. Inside the palace, faces went pale. After what the FBI allegedly found in Prince Harry's California home, the King made a choice that would rewrite royal history. "This is not about anger, it is about duty," a source quietly said. Titles were stripped, lines were drawn. Harry was left devastated and alone, far from the crown that once defined him. This was not a family fight, it was a royal judgment. And what lies inside that FBI report may be the most shocking secret yet. When a father must choose between love and legacy, King Charles III had always been a man of quiet reflection. Those who knew him well understood that beneath the ceremonial robes and practiced smiles lived someone who felt deeply, perhaps too deeply for a king. He rose each morning with the weight of centuries pressing upon his shoulders, yet he carried it with a gentle grace that surprised those expecting cold royal distance. His voice, when he spoke privately, held warmth. His eyes, lined with years of waiting and watching, revealed a soul that had learned patience through decades of preparation. On this particular morning, sunlight filtered weakly through the palace windows as Charles settled into his study. The room smelled of old leather and wood polish, familiar scents that usually brought comfort. He expected the day to unfold, as most did, meetings about parliamentary matters, discussions of charitable initiatives, perhaps a review of upcoming state functions. The rhythm of monarchy had become second nature to him, predictable in its demands. But when his private secretary entered, something in the man's expression made Charles's heart quicken. The secretary carried a single envelope, its seal unbroken, held as though it contained something dangerous. "Your Majesty," the secretary began, his voice barely steady, "this requires your immediate attention." Charles took the envelope with hands that had signed countless documents, hands that had shaken those of presidents and paupers alike. He broke the seal, unfolded the paper inside, and began to read. The words blurred before him, then sharpened into brutal clarity. His breath caught. The careful composure he had cultivated over 7 decades threatened to crack. This was not a matter of state in the ordinary sense. This was personal in a way that made his stomach turn. The briefing detailed allegations, serious ones, involving someone whose face he had watched grow from infant softness to adult features. Someone he had held, guided, and loved despite every complication that love had brought. Charles set the paper down carefully, as if sudden movement might shatter the fragile control he maintained. His mind raced backward through time, sorting through memories like photographs in an album. He remembered arguments about duty versus desire, conversations about responsibility that had gone unheeded, warnings that had seemed harsh then but prophetic now. He had always known that being royal meant living under scrutiny, but he had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that lessons learned through pain might spare the next generation similar suffering. The monarchy was ancient, resilient, yet terrifyingly fragile. Charles understood this better than most. History books filled library shelves with stories of royal houses that had crumbled, not from foreign invasion or economic collapse, but from scandals within. He thought of his own family's past troubles, the divorces, the deaths, the constant battle between private happiness and public duty. Each crisis had threatened to topple the institution, and each time, survival had demanded sacrifices that left scars. He rose from his desk and walked to the window, gazing out at London stretching beyond the palace grounds. Millions of people lived their lives out there, people who looked to the crown as a symbol of continuity, stability, tradition. What would they think? What would they demand? The monarchy existed because the public allowed it to exist, a bargain renewed with each generation. That bargain required trust, and trust, once broken, could rarely be fully repaired. His phone rang, cutting through his thoughts. Charles answered to hear the clipped, professional tone of a senior government official. "Your Majesty, we've received formal communication from American authorities. The matter is being handled at the highest levels, but there are protocols that must be followed. The situation is extremely serious." The words landed like stones in still water. sending ripples through everything Charles thought he understood about the day, the week, the future. American authorities meant this had crossed borders, moved beyond the reach of quiet palace management. It meant lawyers, courts, international cooperation agreements. It meant the machinery of justice grinding forward regardless of bloodlines or titles. "I understand," Charles said, though understanding brought no comfort. "Keep me informed of all developments." After the call ended, he remained standing, phone still in hand. The palace around him suddenly felt enormous and empty. He was King of the United Kingdom, Supreme Governor of the Church of England, head of the Commonwealth. He had duties written into law and constitution. He had responsibilities to millions. And yet, he was also a father. That identity, older and deeper than any crown, pulled at him with fierce insistence. How could these two roles coexist in this moment? A king was meant to be impartial, to represent justice and the rule of law. A father was meant to protect, to defend, to stand between his children and harm. The contradiction felt impossible to navigate. Charles thought about the conversations that would need to happen with advisors, with government officials, with family members who would be devastated by this news. He thought about the public statements that would eventually be required, words that would be parsed and analyzed by millions. Every syllable would matter, every pause would be interpreted. But beneath all the strategic thinking, beneath the institutional concerns and political calculations, a simpler pain throbbed. This was his child, someone he had watched take first steps, speak first words, someone whose failures and successes he had celebrated and mourned in the complicated way parents do. Love did not simply disappear because of allegations, no matter how serious. Love complicated everything. The study's walls seemed to close in slightly. Charles sat down again, feeling suddenly older than his years. He knew what history would expect of him. He knew what the institution demanded. The crown had survived precisely because previous monarchs had made the hard choices, had placed duty above personal feeling when the moment required it. Yet knowing what must be done did not make the doing any easier. He looked at the briefing again, forcing himself to read every detail, to understand the full scope of what was being alleged. The evidence was serious enough that ignoring it was impossible. The involvement of foreign law enforcement meant this would not quietly disappear. Outside, London continued its daily rhythm, unaware that within palace walls, a king sat wrestling with questions that had no good answers. How does a father prepare to make decisions that might forever alter his relationship with his own child? How does a monarch balance personal love against institutional survival? Where does duty end and heartbreak begin, the day freedom became a cage? Harry had always possessed a restless heart. Even as a boy running through palace corridors, he had carried within him a wildness that royal protocol could never quite tame. Those who truly knew him recognized the warmth behind his famous grin, a genuine kindness that made strangers feel seen and understood. He laughed easily, loved fiercely, and wore his emotions close to the surface in a way that endeared him to millions. But beneath that charm lived something else, a deep yearning for a life that felt authentically his own. On this particular morning, Harry stood in his kitchen making breakfast. Simple movements, ordinary tasks. The coffee maker gurgled. Sunlight streamed through windows overlooking carefully tended gardens. He had dressed casually, comfortably, in the kind of clothes that would have raised eyebrows at any official engagement back home. This was the freedom he had fought for, the peace he had sacrificed so much to claim. Yet even here, thousands of miles from Buckingham Palace, he sometimes felt the pull of what he had left behind. Late at night, when sleep proved elusive, memories surfaced unbidden. His mother's laughter, his brother's face before everything became complicated, the sound of military boots on parade grounds. He had told himself repeatedly that leaving was right, necessary, the only path toward genuine happiness. But the human heart rarely accepts such neat explanations. The knock at the door came without warning. Harry glanced toward the entrance, frowning slightly. He was not expecting visitors. When he opened the door, his confusion deepened into something colder. 3 men and a woman stood on his doorstep, their expressions professionally neutral. They wore suits that screamed authority, and the badges they presented identified them as federal agents. "Prince Harry," the lead agent began, his voice flat and procedural. "We have a warrant to search these premises." The words seemed to arrive from very far away. Harry's mind struggled to process them, to fit them into the ordinary morning he had been living moments before. A warrant? Here? The agent extended papers toward him, crisp legal documents covered in official seals and dense paragraphs of text. "There must be some mistake," Harry said, hearing the uncertainty in his own voice. "We need you to step aside, sir." The agents moved past him with practiced efficiency, dispersing through his home like water finding every crack. Harry stood frozen in his own entryway, watching strangers invade the sanctuary he had built. There was no shouting, no drama. Everything unfolded with calm, methodical precision, which somehow made it more unsettling. Doors opened, drawers slid out. Hands gloved in latex sorted through belongings with clinical detachment. Harry's wife appeared, her face pale with shock. They exchanged a glance that communicated everything words could not: confusion, fear, disbelief. How had their carefully constructed life arrived at this moment? What had they done, or failed to do, that brought federal agents into their home? The search continued for what felt like hours but was likely less. Harry watched, feeling helpless in a way he had not experienced since childhood, since those terrible days after his mother passed away when the world spun beyond his control. He wanted to demand explanations, to assert some authority, but what authority did he possess here? He was not a working royal anymore. He had no diplomatic immunity, no palace lawyers on speed dial. He was simply a resident of California, subject to its laws like anyone else. Then one of the agents called out. The tone was different, sharper, more focused. Harry's stomach dropped. He moved toward the study where the voice had originated, dread building with each step. The agent stood beside Harry's desk, holding something that Harry recognized immediately. His throat tightened. "Sir, we need to ask you about this," the agent said. Harry looked at the object, then at the faces surrounding him, and felt the walls of his new life closing in. Whatever freedom he thought he had claimed suddenly seemed as fragile as morning mist. The thing they had found unexpected, damning, impossible to explain away sat in the agent's gloved hands like evidence of a truth Harry had tried desperately to deny. "I can explain," he began, but even as the words left his mouth, he wondered if an explanation was possible. How do you make people understand choices that seem inexplicable even to yourself? The lead agent's expression remained unchanged. "You'll have the opportunity to do that. For now, we need you to come with us to answer some questions." Harry's mind raced. Questions meant interrogation rooms, lawyers, formal statements. It meant this situation was real, serious, potentially catastrophic. He thought of his family, the one he had built here and the one he had left behind. He thought of his father, an ocean away, who would soon learn of this development if he had not already. Shame burned through him, mixed with anger at himself, at circumstances, at the impossibility of ever truly escaping who you are. "Am I being arrested?" he asked quietly. "Not at this time, but we strongly advise you to cooperate fully." Cooperation, as if he had a choice. Harry looked around his home, at the life he and his wife had worked so hard to create. It all seemed suddenly insubstantial, a dream from which he was rudely awakening. The distance he had put between himself and the palace, the independence he had fought for, none of it had protected him. Perhaps nothing ever could. He nodded slowly, feeling ancient and young all at once. "Let me get my things." As he moved to gather his phone and wallet, Harry caught his reflection in a hallway mirror. The face looking back seemed unfamiliar, haunted by questions that had no easy answers. Was this truly a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with simple explanation? Or was it something darker, the beginning of consequences he had somehow always known were coming? The weight of evidence. Agent Sarah Mitchell had spent 23 years believing in the simple power of truth. She was not someone who impressed easily or cared much for celebrity. Her colleagues at the Federal Bureau of Investigation knew her as meticulous, fair-minded, and utterly incorruptible. She possessed a quiet strength that came from years of sorting through lies to find fragments of reality. When she smiled, which was not often during work hours, her entire face softened, revealing the mother and wife beneath the badge. But when duty called, Sarah became something else entirely, a relentless seeker of facts, indifferent to wealth, fame, or title. She had grown up in a modest home in Michigan, the daughter of a school teacher and a factory worker. Her parents had taught her that everyone, regardless of position, deserved equal treatment under the law. That principle had guided her through complex cases involving politicians, corporate executives, and organized crime figures. She had never wavered, never been swayed by pressure or intimidation. The law was the law, and Sarah Mitchell served it with a devotion that bordered on sacred. On this gray afternoon, she sat in a windowless conference room at the Los Angeles field office, surrounded by evidence bags, photographs, and preliminary reports. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow. Her team had completed the search that morning, and now came the harder work making sense of what they had found. Sarah spread the materials across the table methodically. Her partner, Agent Tom Reeves, sat across from her, reviewing documents on his laptop. Tom was younger, still occasionally awed by the high-profile nature of certain cases. He glanced up at Sarah with an expression mixing disbelief and concern. "This is going to create an international incident," he said quietly. Sarah did not look up from the evidence she was examining. "Our job is not to worry about politics. Our job is to follow where the facts lead." "I know. But Sarah, I know exactly who we're talking about," she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "And it changes nothing. If this were anyone else, what would we do?" Tom nodded slowly. He had worked with Sarah long enough to know that arguing was pointless when she invoked that principle. She was right, of course. The badge they wore meant treating everyone equally, without favor or fear. Still, the implications made his stomach tight. Sarah picked up a clear evidence bag containing a small electronic device. She had seen hundreds like it over her career, but context always mattered. What made an object innocuous or incriminating was not the thing itself, but what it contained, what it revealed about intent and action. She turned it over in her hands, thinking through the chain of custody, the analysis that would need to happen, the reports that would need to be filed. "The digital forensics team will need at least 48 hours for a complete analysis," Tom said, reading from his notes. "But the preliminary scan already shows some concerning patterns." Sarah set the bag down carefully, defined concerning. Tom clicked through several screens, then turned his laptop so she could see. Lines of data scrolled past, timestamps and file transfers, communications that had been carefully hidden but not hidden well enough. Sarah leaned forward, her trained eyes picking apart the information, seeing connections that others might miss. "Communications with known subjects of ongoing investigations," Tom explained. "Financial transactions that don't match any legitimate purpose we can identify. And the encrypted files, they're still working on those. But the metadata alone suggests content we need to examine very closely." Sarah felt the familiar weight settling over her, the gravity that came with cases that would alter lives. She never took satisfaction in this part of her work, never felt triumph when evidence pointed toward guilt. Instead, she felt the solemn responsibility of someone entrusted with enormous power, the power to document truth, regardless of how painful that truth might be. "We need to contact the legal attaché at the embassy," she said. "This has international dimensions that require coordination." Tom nodded. "And we need to prepare a report for Washington. The director will want to be briefed personally before this goes any further." Sarah stood and walked to the window, though it offered only a view of the parking garage. She thought about the person whose life they were examining, dissecting with professional detachment. She knew his face from news coverage, knew the broad strokes of his story, the tragedy, the rebellion, the eventual departure from royal duties. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was what the evidence showed, what could be proven, what the law demanded. Her phone buzzed. The forensics team had completed the first phase of their analysis. Sarah read the text message, her expression unchanging, though her pulse quickened slightly. The findings were worse than initially thought. Not a misunderstanding, not a gray area that could be explained away. Clear, documented evidence of activities that crossed legal boundaries. She returned to the table where Tom waited. "Start drafting the report. I want every detail documented, every procedure followed to the letter. When this becomes public, and it will become public, our work needs to be beyond reproach." "What angle do we take?" Tom asked. "There is no angle. We present facts. We outline what was found, where it was found, and what it appears to indicate. We recommend next steps based on standard protocols. Nothing more, nothing less." Over the next several hours, they worked steadily, constructing a document that would travel up the chain of command, across an ocean, and eventually land on desks where decisions far above their pay grade would be made. Sarah wrote with the same precision she brought to every case, aware that her words would be read by people in the highest levels of government, both American and British. As evening approached, the report neared completion. Sarah reviewed it one final time, checking for accuracy, ensuring that nothing was overstated or minimized. The evidence spoke clearly enough without embellishment. She had included photographs, forensic summaries, and a timeline that showed how the investigation had unfolded. Tom prepared the secure transmission, encrypting the files according to protocol. "Ready when you are," he said. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, thinking about the chain reaction this single document would trigger. She thought about the family that would be torn apart, the institutions that would be shaken, the public trust that would be tested. Then she thought about the victims, because there were always victims in cases like this, people whose suffering demanded justice, regardless of who had caused it. "Send it," she said. Tom pressed several keys, and the report began its electronic journey, first to FBI headquarters in Washington, then, through official channels, to the State Department. From there, through diplomatic pouches and secure communications, to the American Embassy in London, and finally, through carefully orchestrated protocols, to British authorities who would have the unenviable task of informing the palace. Sarah knew that somewhere across the Atlantic, her words would soon be read by people grappling with impossible choices. A king would be forced to confront evidence about his own son. Advisors would debate how to handle a crisis that threatened the monarchy itself. Lawyers would parse every sentence looking for ways to minimize damage or mount defenses. But Sarah Mitchell would not be part of those conversations. Her role was simpler and perhaps more important. She had documented the truth as thoroughly and fairly as human effort allowed. She had done her duty without fear or favor, treating a prince exactly as she would treat any other person under investigation. As she gathered her materials and prepared to leave the office, Tom spoke quietly. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing? I mean, the consequences here are enormous." Sarah looked at him with something like sympathy. "The consequences of ignoring evidence would be worse. We don't get to choose who the law applies to, Tom. That's not justice. That's privilege." She walked out into the California evening, where traffic hummed and ordinary people went about ordinary lives, unaware that in a conference room downtown, agents had just set in motion events that would shake nations. Sarah felt tired but clean in her conscience. She had done what the badge demanded, what her oath required, what her parents had taught her was right, the prince who could not falter. William had always been the steady one. From childhood, he had understood that his life would follow a path marked out long before his birth. Where others might rebel or question, William accepted with a quiet dignity that impressed even the most skeptical observers. His demeanor radiated calm competence, the kind of person you would trust in a crisis, the one who keeps his head while others panic. Yet those who knew him beyond the ceremonial facade recognized something more. When he played with his children, his laughter came freely and without restraint. When he spoke about causes close to his heart, passion broke through the practiced composure. He was not cold, merely careful, not unfeeling, just deeply aware that his feelings could never simply belong to him alone. The phone call came during breakfast. William had been helping his youngest with cereal, enjoying the small chaos of a family morning. When he saw the private secretary's name on the screen, something in his chest tightened. Calls at this hour rarely brought good news. He stepped into the hallway, pressing the phone to his ear. Yes? The voice on the other end was measured but urgent. There had been a development, a serious one, concerning his brother. William listened without interrupting, his free hand gripping the doorframe as the words assembled themselves into a picture he did not want to see. When the call ended, he stood motionless for several moments. Through the doorway, he could hear his children's voices, bright and unconcerned. His wife appeared, reading his expression with the accuracy that came from years together. "What is it?" she asked softly. William met her eyes and saw his own worry reflected back. "It's Harry. There's been an incident in California. The FBI is involved." He watched understanding dawn across her face, followed by the same conflicted emotions churning inside him. She reached for his hand, squeezing once, a silent communication of support. William appreciated the gesture even as he felt himself withdrawing into the role that situations like this demanded. Personal feelings would need to wait. Duty called first. He made his way to his study and closed the door. Sitting at his desk, William allowed himself a moment to simply breathe. His mind drifted backward against his will, pulling up memories he usually kept carefully stored away. 2 boys running through palace gardens, laughing at shared jokes that adults would not understand. Brothers united in grief at their mother's funeral, the world watching as they walked behind her coffin with devastating composure. Late-night conversations about dreams and fears, back when they still confided in each other without filters or distance. When had it changed? William could not point to a single moment. Perhaps it was gradual, an accumulation of small divergences that eventually became a chasm too wide to cross. Harry had always been different, more emotional, more willing to challenge convention. William had envied that freedom sometimes, even as he could never quite permit himself the same latitude. He was the heir. The spare could afford to be reckless in ways the future king could not. But envy had given way to concern as Harry's choices became increasingly difficult to defend. The move to America had felt like a betrayal initially, though William had tried to understand. He wanted his brother to be happy, truly, but happiness at what cost? At the expense of duty, of family unity, of the institution they were both born to serve? Now this. Whatever had happened in California, whatever the FBI had uncovered, would not remain private. William knew the machinery of scandal, how quickly whispers became headlines. His father would be devastated. The monarchy would face another crisis, and William would be expected to stand firm, to represent stability while everything around him threatened to crumble. He thought about calling Harry directly but dismissed the idea. What would he say? The distance between them was not merely geographic. Years of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings had built walls that phone calls could not easily breach. Part of William wanted to rage at his brother for this latest disaster. Another part wanted to protect him, to fix whatever had gone wrong the way older brothers are supposed to do. But William was not just an older brother anymore. He was second in line to the throne, a working royal with responsibilities that superseded personal relationships. The public expected him to be measured, thoughtful, above the fray. He could not be seen choosing family loyalty over principle. That was not how future kings behaved. His phone buzzed with a message from his father's office requesting a meeting. William replied, confirming his availability, then sat back in his chair, feeling ancient despite his years. This was the cost of his position, he realized. Always doing the right thing, even when the right thing felt wrong. Always putting duty first, even when his heart pulled him in another direction. He remembered his mother once saying that the hardest part of royal life was not the public scrutiny or the endless obligations, but the loneliness of having to constantly weigh personal desires against institutional needs. At the time, William had not fully understood. Now, facing a situation where his brother needed support but his role demanded distance, the words made painful sense. William stood and walked to the window. Outside, Groundskeepers tended the gardens with the same careful attention they had shown for generations. Continuity, stability, tradition, these were the values the monarchy represented. These were what he would be expected to uphold, regardless of what it cost him personally. He thought about his children, still eating breakfast, still innocent of the storm gathering. What would he tell them about their uncle? How would he explain that sometimes families fracture, that sometimes love is not enough to overcome the weight of consequences? A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Duty called, as it always did. William straightened his shoulders, arranged his features into the expression of calm authority that people expected, and prepared to do what the future king must do. His heart might ache for the brother he remembered, but his actions would serve the crown he would someday wear. What does it cost to always do the right thing? William was learning the answer with every breath. It cost exactly everything you wanted to give freely but could not afford to spare. The hardest command a father ever gave. King Charles had always believed in second chances. Throughout his life, he had shown remarkable patience with people's failings, understanding that growth often came through mistakes. His eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with the crown he wore, and his voice, even in moments of disagreement, rarely lost its compassionate edge. He was a father before he was a king in his own mind, though the world seldom allowed him that luxury. Today, those two identities would collide in a way that would leave permanent scars. The folder sat before him on the desk, thick with documentation that had arrived from across the Atlantic. Charles had read through it 3 times already, hoping each review might reveal something different, some detail that would change the terrible clarity of what lay before him. But facts remained facts, regardless of how many times you examined them or how desperately you wished them away. His private secretary stood nearby, waiting with the practiced patience of someone who understood that monarchs needed time to process impossible decisions. The room felt smaller than usual, the air heavier. Outside the windows, London carried on with its usual rhythm, unaware that within these walls, a king wrestled with a choice that would alter his family forever. "Are we absolutely certain?" Charles asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "There can be no doubt?" "The evidence has been verified through multiple sources, Your Majesty. American authorities, our own intelligence services, independent legal review, all conclusions align." Charles nodded slowly, feeling something inside him crack. He thought of Harry as a child, grinning with gap-toothed joy. He remembered teaching him to ride, watching him graduate from military academy, seeing pride flash across his face at small accomplishments. Where had that boy gone? When had the path diverged so completely from what anyone could have imagined? But personal sorrow could not override constitutional responsibility. Charles understood this with brutal clarity. The monarchy survived because it held itself to standards that transcended individual desires. If the institution showed favoritism, bent rules for family while expecting others to obey them, it would lose the moral authority upon which its continued existence depended. "Prepare the statement," Charles said, each word feeling like a stone he was swallowing. "Harry will be stripped of all remaining royal titles and patronages, effective immediately." The secretary's pen moved across paper, recording the command that would be formalized in official documents. Charles watched the writing, thinking how simple it looked, just ink-forming letters. Yet these words would echo through history, would be debated and analyzed for generations. "The wording must be precise," Charles continued, his voice steadier now, settling into the role that duty demanded. "We acknowledge the serious nature of the findings. We express that this decision was not made lightly but is necessary to uphold the values the monarchy represents. We make clear that no one, regardless of birth or position, stands above accountability." "Yes, Your Majesty." Charles stood and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that had become second nature over decades. He could see his reflection faintly in the glass, an old man in fine clothes, bearing weight invisible to observers. How did you separate the personal from the institutional when they were so completely intertwined? How did a father give an order that would devastate his own son? The answer, Charles knew, was that you simply did it. You made the choice that principles demanded, even when every fiber of your being screamed in protest. That was what leadership meant at its most painful. News of the decision would spread through the palace first, then ripple outward to the wider world. But within these walls, there would be no triumphant announcements, no sense of satisfaction. Charles could already feel the somber mood settling over the staff, the way people would speak in hushed tones, averting their eyes from one another. An institution mourning, that was what this was. The monarchy grieving for one of its own while simultaneously cutting him away like diseased flesh to preserve the healthy body. There was no precedent for doing both simultaneously, no protocol for institutional sorrow. Charles signed the necessary documents with a hand that remained remarkably steady despite the turmoil beneath. Each signature felt like a small death, an ending of possibilities that would never return. When the final page was completed, he set down the pen and closed his eyes briefly. "See that this is handled with appropriate gravity," he instructed, "and ensure that Harry is informed privately before any public announcement." The secretary gathered the papers and withdrew, leaving Charles alone. The king sat in the silence that followed, feeling it press against him from all sides. Somewhere across an ocean, his son would soon learn that the final threads connecting him to his birthright had been severed by his own father's hand. Can an institution mourn while standing firm? Charles had just proven it could, though the cost of that proof would haunt him through every day that remained. When everything falls away, Harry had always been resilient. Even through the darkest moments of his life, losing his mother, serving in war zones, navigating public scrutiny, he had found ways to keep moving forward. There was a softness to him that people often missed beneath the headlines, a vulnerability that made him reach out to wounded veterans and struggling children with genuine empathy. He felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply for someone born into such an unforgiving spotlight. Now, sitting in his California home with official documents spread before him, that resilience faced its greatest test. The letter had arrived through formal channels, cold and precise in its language, stripped of all titles, removed from all patronages, severed from the institution that had defined him since birth. Harry read the words again, hoping somehow they might rearrange themselves into something less final. They did not. He thought about his father signing these orders, imagining the scene: Charles at his desk, pen in hand, choosing duty over blood. Part of Harry felt anger rising hot in his chest. Another part understood with terrible clarity that this outcome had been inevitable from the moment federal agents knocked on his door. Perhaps it had been inevitable long before that, set in motion by choices he had made without fully grasping their weight. "What happens now?" his wife asked quietly from the doorway. Harry looked up, seeing concern etched across her features. "Now we're just ordinary people, I suppose." The words felt strange on his tongue. Ordinary. He had never been ordinary, had never known what that truly meant. Even in rebellion, even in departure, he had carried titles that connected him to something larger. Now those connections were cut, and he floated untethered in a way that was both terrifying and oddly liberating. Across the ocean, Charles sat in the same study where he had made his decision. The deed was done, the announcement issued, the world informed. He had done what monarchs must do, protected the institution above all else. But alone in the quiet, he allowed himself to grieve the relationship that might never recover, the son who might never forgive him. "I had no choice," he whispered to the empty room, though he was not certain if that was the truth or merely comfort. The palace continued its eternal rhythm. Staff attended to duties, schedules marched forward. The monarchy, that ancient institution, absorbed the shock and adapted as it had countless times before. Visitors to Buckingham Palace saw no outward change, no sign of the private devastation that had occurred within its walls. William carried on with his engagements, his face carefully composed, answering no questions about family matters. The crown would endure, it always did. That was both its strength and its curse, the ability to survive by sacrificing pieces of itself. Harry sat in California sunshine that felt less warm than before, holding documents that reduced his entire birthright to revoked privileges. He was no longer His Royal Highness, no longer a prince in any official capacity, Just a man who had once been those things, now facing a future he would have to build entirely from scratch. Is this the end of the story? Or only the beginning of something neither father nor son could yet imagine, a new chapter written without titles, without palaces, without the weight of crowns, but still carrying the unbreakable bond and irreparable breach that only family can create?